November 19th, 1944. Outside Bourg-Altroff, France. The morning mist clung to the frozen ground as a German anti-tank gunner peered through his gun sight at the approaching American Sherman tanks. For 3 days, his unit had been engaged with these particular American tankers, and something was deeply wrong with everything Nazi racial instructors had taught him. The lead tank, visibly damaged and trailing smoke, continued advancing despite taking multiple hits. Through his optics, Schmidt could see the tank commander, unmistakably a black soldier, exposed in the turret, firing the .50 caliber machine gun despite the obvious danger. This was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, though Schmidt wouldn't learn his name until decades later when historians pieced together this encounter. Despite being severely wounded, his leg slashed to the bone, Staff Sergeant Rivers declined an injection of morphine, refused to be evacuated, took command of another tank, and advanced with his company into Gaebling the next day. For 3 days, Rivers had continued fighting with a gangrenous wound that should have incapacitated any soldier. What Schmidt witnessed in those final moments before Rivers' tank was destroyed would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because of the violence, but because it shattered everything he had been taught about racial superiority. The inferior soldiers were displaying courage that exceeded anything he had witnessed in 5 years of war. The 761st Tank Battalion's entrance into World War II represented more than just another American unit joining the fight. It was the collision of two fundamentally opposed worldviews, Nazi racial ideology meeting its complete refutation on the battlefield. The 761st Tank Battalion's motto was, "Come out fighting," and that it did, from its first engagement at the little Belgian town of Morville-le-Vicq in November 1944, and through heavy combat right through to the end of the war. But their fight carried a double meaning that German forces would soon understand in the most direct way possible. Among the German forces preparing to face them were units that had been indoctrinated since childhood in racial superiority. The Wehrmacht's training materials specifically stated that black soldiers were incapable of operating complex machinery, lacked courage, and would flee at the first sign of combat. These weren't just casual prejudices, but fundamental beliefs that shaped German military doctrine and expectations. The 761st would spend 183 consecutive days proving every one of these assumptions catastrophically wrong. The 761st was constituted on the 15th of March 1942 and activated the 1st of April 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The activation came not from any progressive military thinking, but from what internal War Department documents called political necessity to maintain Negro morale. The battalion's path to combat was unlike any white unit. The men of the 761st trained for almost 2 years, conscious of the fact that white units were being sent overseas after much less training. While white armoured battalions deployed after 12 to 16 weeks of training, the 761st would train for over 2 years, mastering every aspect of armoured warfare, because they knew any mistake would be attributed not to the individual but to their entire race. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, the white officer who commanded the battalion, was considered career dead for accepting the position. But Bates had served in World War I and had seen French colonial troops fight with distinction. More importantly, he judged men by ability, not colour. His assessment after 2 years, the 761st, was the best-trained tank battalion in the United States Army. Among the men who would prove him right was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers from Hotulka, Oklahoma, standing 6 feet 2 inches, who had grown up on a farm and possessed what Bates called an intuitive understanding of terrain and tactics. There was Warren G.H. Creasy, who would earn the nickname Iron Man for his extraordinary combat endurance. And there was the battalion's most famous member who would never see combat, First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson of the 761, an athlete who would become one of the greatest baseball players of all time, lost his chance to see combat when he refused to move to the back of a segregated military bus during an incident at Fort Hood, Texas, in July 1944. After the 2-year training session in Texas, 761st Tank Battalion received the order in 9 June 1944 for overseas movement 3 days after the D-Day landings in Normandy. They crossed the Atlantic on the British trooper Esperance Bay, arriving in England on September 8, 1944. After a brief deployment to England, the 761st landed in France via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. They were immediately attached to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton's initial skepticism about black tankers was well documented. He had written to his wife that he doubted their ability to think fast enough for armoured warfare. Yet on October 28, 1944, Patton delivered his famous speech to the battalion. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what colour you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut's sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you." On November 7, 1944, the Black Panthers finally got their chance as they attacked the German-held town of Morville-le-Vicq in support of the 26th Infantry Division. The German defenders, a mix of Wehrmacht infantry and anti-tank units, expected an easy victory against what they had been told were America's inferior troops. The battle lasted 4 hours. Right inside the town, King's lead tank was knocked out by a German Panzerfaust. 2 of King's crew were wounded. Their comrades dragged them to safety behind the tank and then went on to kill the soldier with the Panzerfaust. German after-action reports, discovered in military archives, noted with surprise the exceptional tactical proficiency of the attacking tank unit. They had expected panic when the first tank was hit. Instead, the 761st executed a coordinated assault that systematically eliminated German positions. Another tank commander, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, encountered a German roadblock that forced his tank to a halt. Under heavy enemy small arms fire, he leaped out of the tank, attached a cable from his Sherman to the roadblock, remounted, and then had his tank pull the obstacle off the road, freeing the tank column to resume the advance and capture the town. Rivers would receive the Silver Star for this action, the first of many decorations the battalion would earn. November 1944 saw the 761st in constant combat. The unit endured 183 days of continuous operational employment. The 761st Tank Battalion suffered 156 casualties in November 1944. 24 men killed, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses. The unit also lost 14 tanks evacuated and another 20 damaged in combat. These dry statistics don't capture what German forces were learning. The black tankers they had been told would flee, at first contact were instead maintaining an operational tempo that exceeded most white American units. While typical tank battalions were rotated to the rear after 10 to 14 days of combat, the 761 would remain on the front lines continuously. German intelligence reports from this period, housed in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, begin showing confusion about the identity of these tankers. One report from the 11th Panzer Division notes, "Enemy tank unit operating in Sector 7 displays exceptional maintenance of vehicles and aggressive tactics inconsistent with intelligence assessments." The most dramatic demonstration of the 761st's determination came during the assault on Gebling. On November 16, 1944, while advancing toward the town of Gebling, France, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank hit a mine at a railroad crossing. Although severely wounded, his leg slashed to the bone, Staff Sergeant Rivers declined an injection of morphine, refused to be evacuated, took command of another tank, and advanced with his company into Gebling the next day. Captain David Williams, Rivers's company commander, repeatedly ordered him to evacuate. Rivers's response, documented in Williams's report, "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A medic inspecting Rivers's swollen and infected leg looked up. "Listen, he's got gangrene," he shouted. But Williams only had time to say Reuben before German guns again zeroed in, forcing the Americans to take cover. On November 19th, 1944, the end came. At dawn that day, Company A's tanks advanced toward Bogaltov, their next objective, but were stopped by enemy fire. Captain David J. Williams, the company commander, ordered his tanks to withdraw and take cover. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, radioed that he had spotted the German anti-tank positions. "I see 'em. We'll fight 'em." Staff Sergeant Rivers, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on enemy tanks, covering Company A as they withdrew. While doing so, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank was hit, killing him and wounding the rest of the crew. Captain Williams immediately recommended Rivers for the Medal of Honor, though it would take 52 years for the recommendation to be acted upon. December 16th, 1944, brought the Wehrmacht's last major offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st was attached to the 87th Infantry Division and thrown into the desperate fight to stop the German breakthrough. The battalion faced some of Germany's best remaining units, including elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite formation expanded from Hitler's personal escort battalion. The fighting around Tillit, Belgium, was particularly brutal. These were hard to come by, and many of the new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were raw and untrained, or, being rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. Despite receiving inadequate replacements, the 761st continued fighting. The fighting was brutal, and the 761st Tank Battalion Shermans and 87th Division Infantry had to struggle against bitter resistance every step of the way. The German forces included Tiger tanks whose 88mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns couldn't penetrate the Tiger's armour. Yet the 761st developed tactics to compensate. They used their superior mobility to flank the heavier German tanks and their mechanical reliability to maintain more vehicles in action. One of his tankers, Sergeant Frank C. Cochran, shouted over the radio, "They've hit me 3 times, but I'm still giving them hell." By January 9th, 1945, Tillit was in American hands. The 761st had helped stop the German offensive, but at a heavy cost. February and March 1945 saw the 761st participating in the assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's last major fortification system. The battalion was attached to the 103rd Infantry Division for the assault. Within a few days, the Siegfried Line was broken, and enemy troops came forward to surrender in increasingly large numbers. By March 23rd, the Black Panthers had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted 4,000 casualties, and captured nearly as many prisoners. The combat here was different from France and Belgium. Now they were on German soil, facing increasingly desperate resistance from Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units defending their homeland. Yet German soldiers were also beginning to surrender in larger numbers, particularly when they realized they were facing the black tankers they had heard about. Prisoners were terrified to be captured by black soldiers, believing, thanks to their own propaganda, that they could expect no mercy from such savages. African Americans of the 761st learned not to rise up out of their tank hatches until the Germans came close, lest the surrendering troops see their black skins, howl in terror, and run away. This fear, based entirely on Nazi propaganda about black soldiers being savage and merciless, proved completely unfounded. The 761st treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention protocols, often sharing their own rations with captured Germans. As the 761st crossed into Germany proper in March 1945, they encountered scenes that revealed the true nature of the regime they were fighting. German civilians, conditioned by years of racial propaganda, were terrified of the black soldiers. Many fled rather than remain in areas occupied by the 761st. Yet the battalion maintained strict discipline. There were no reprisals against civilians, no looting, no revenge attacks despite the racial hatred they knew these people had been taught. This professional conduct confused German civilians who had expected the racial inferiors to behave like the savages depicted in Nazi propaganda. The tank battles continued as the 761 pushed deeper into Germany. They faced Panthers, Tigers, and the desperate resistance of SS units. Warren G.H. Cressy, who had earned his Iron Man nickname, was particularly notable during this period. He would often dismount his tank at night with an M1 Garand rifle to conduct personal reconnaissance missions. One of the most profound moments in the 761st's combat history came on May 4th to 5th, 1945. A grimmer encounter took place on May 2nd, when the tankers liberated Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria, discovering some 15,000 Hungarian Jews near death from starvation. The scene that greeted the black tankers defied description. Thousands of skeletal figures, many unable to stand, filled the camp. The SS guards had fled days earlier, leaving the prisoners to die. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later recalled, "Here were people who looked like skeletons, trying to smile, trying to wave. Some of them were crying. We gave them everything we had, our rations, our chocolate, everything." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Nazi Germany's supposed racial inferiors were liberating the victims of racial hatred. One woman liberated by the unit, 17-year-old Sonja Schreiber-Weitz, described the soldier who saved her in the poem The Black Messiah. "A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die, I thought. He must be the Messiah." By the end of April 1945, the 761 would be one of the first US battalions to meet up with Soviet forces. The meeting occurred at Steyr, Austria, in early May 1945. Sources vary between April 26th and May 5th to 6th. Tanker Leonard Smith received the shock of his life when a stout Russian woman tanker approached him, shouting, "America! America! America!" She swathed him in a tight hug until he could hardly breathe. The Soviet forces, including female tank crews, showed no surprise at seeing black American tankers. For them, what mattered was that these were fellow soldiers who had survived the brutal fight against Nazi Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion's combat record speaks for itself. 183 consecutive days of combat, November 7th, 1944, May 6th, 1945. 6 countries traversed: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, Austria. 4 major campaigns: Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, Central Europe. Casualties inflicted: approximately 4,000 German casualties, per National World War II Museum records. German equipment destroyed. Hundreds of vehicles, 31 pillboxes, 49 machine gun emplacements, 29 anti-tank guns captured. Unit casualties: nearly 50% casualty rate. Initial strength: 36 officers, 30 black, 6 white, and 676 enlisted men. Tanks lost: 71 total. Awards: 1 Medal of Honor, posthumously to Reuben Rivers in 1997, 7 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, approximately 246 to 300 Purple Hearts. While specific Wehrmacht documents mentioning the 761st by designation are limited, German reactions to black American troops are well documented in military archives and prisoner interrogations. One surrendering German officer asked, "How many Negro Panzer divisions are there?" When told there was only 1 battalion, he refused to believe it. The continuous presence of the 761st over 183 days had created the impression of a much larger force. German prisoners repeatedly expressed surprise at the combat effectiveness of black troops. Interrogation reports from 1945, now housed in the US National Archives, show German soldiers struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they had been taught about racial superiority. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant told interrogators, "We were told the Negroes would run at the first shot. Instead, they kept coming even when we knocked out their tanks." This was not what we expected. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the 761st's fight was far from over. Like their white comrades, African-American tankers struggled with memories and, in some cases, post-traumatic stress. Unlike white soldiers, however, black soldiers dealt with segregation and the often savage racial prejudice characteristic of this period in American history. Texas native Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade, Jr. described the contradictions for black soldiers coming back to the United States in an oral history, saying, "We didn't have equal rights. Democracy was against us." The men who had destroyed German tanks and liberated concentration camps returned to an America where they couldn't eat in many restaurants, had to sit in the back of buses and faced violent racism. German prisoners of war held in the United States were often treated better than the black soldiers who had captured them. For 33 years, the 761st Tank Battalion's achievements went officially unrecognized at the unit level. Individual medals were awarded, but the Presidential Unit Citation that white battalions received immediately was denied. It wasn't until January 24, 1978, that President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st. The citation read in part, "The 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in the accomplishment of unusually difficult and hazardous operations." The ultimate recognition came in 1997, when 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously received the Medal of Honor. Not until over 50 years later, on January 12, 1997, was the Medal of Honor finally bestowed on Platoon Sergeant Reuben Rivers. President Clinton noted at the ceremony, "No African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II received it. Today we fill the gap in that picture and give a group of heroes, who also love peace but adapted themselves to war, the tribute that has always been their due." One of the most interesting transformations involved General Patton himself. Despite his initial skepticism about black soldiers, Patton's assessment of the 761 Saint changed dramatically through their service. During the Battle of the Bulge, German soldiers who had raided American warehouses were reported to have disguised themselves as Americans guarding checkpoints in order to ambush American soldiers. Patton solved this problem by ordering black soldiers, including the 761st, to guard the checkpoints, and gave the order to shoot any white soldiers at the checkpoints who acted suspiciously. This order demonstrated remarkable trust. Patton was literally placing the security of his entire army in the hands of black soldiers he had once doubted could think fast enough for armoured warfare. By the end of the war, Patton had recommended the 761 Saint for numerous commendations. While his personal racial views remained complex and problematic, his military assessment of the battalion was unequivocal. They were among his best units. Ironically, the racism that kept the 761st training for 2 years instead of the standard few months became their greatest advantage. The men of the 761st trained for almost 2 years, conscious of the fact that white units were being sent overseas after much less training. This extensive training meant that when the 761st finally entered combat, they were possibly the best prepared tank battalion in the US Army. They could perform maintenance in complete darkness, had memorized every aspect of their tank's operation, and had developed a unit cohesion that only comes from extended time together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later testified, "The delay in sending them to combat, which was wrong and racist, accidentally created the best-trained tank battalion in the Army. They could do things with Shermans that shouldn't have been possible." While Reuben Rivers received the most recognition, Warren G. H. Creasy's story deserves special attention. Known as Iron Man, Creasy survived the entire war despite being wounded multiple times and destroying extraordinary amounts of German equipment. During one engagement, Creasy's tank was knocked out by German fire. Instead of withdrawing, he took control of a .50 caliber machine gun on a half-track and used it to cover his crew's escape while destroying the German position. He would often volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, leading reconnaissance missions on foot behind enemy lines. Creasy survived the war, but like many veterans, struggled with what would now be recognized as PTSD. He rarely spoke about his experiences, and it wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that his extraordinary service received proper recognition. One aspect of the 761st Service that surprised German forces was their mechanical proficiency. Nazi propaganda had insisted that black soldiers couldn't operate complex machinery. Instead, the 761st maintained one of the highest operational readiness rates in the Third Army. This was partly due to their extended training, but also to the dedication of men like Technician 5th Grade William Harvey, who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. The battalion's maintenance crews worked through the night, often under fire, to keep tanks running. German reports expressed bewilderment at seeing damaged Sherman tanks they thought permanently destroyed reappear days later, fully operational. The 761st's ability to maintain their vehicles under combat conditions exceeded that of many veteran Wehrmacht units. Facing superior German tanks like Tigers and Panthers, the 761st developed innovative tactics. The Sherman's 75mm gun often couldn't penetrate the frontal armour of German heavy tanks, so the 761st perfected flanking manoeuvres they called cat hunting. One Sherman would act as bait, drawing fire and revealing the German position. Two others would then race to flanking positions, targeting the thinner side and rear armour. This required extraordinary coordination and courage. The bait tank was often destroyed. These tactics were studied and adopted by other American armoured units. The 761st's combat innovations contributed to the overall improvement of American armoured doctrine in the European theatre. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 761 played a crucial role in relieving the encircled 101 Airborne Division at Bastogne. While Patton's relief of Bastogne is well known, the role of the 761 is often overlooked. Fighting through terrible winter conditions, with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the battalion helped punch through German lines. They faced not just regular Wehrmacht, but also SS units making desperate attempts to maintain the encirclement. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and running low on everything, watched as the 761st's Shermans broke through German lines. One paratrooper later recalled, "We didn't care what colour they were. They were the most beautiful sight we'd ever seen." The 761st produced exceptional combat leaders. Captain Erwin McHenry, Captain John Long, and Lieutenant Charles Barber all demonstrated tactical brilliance under fire. These black officers commanded not through formal military hierarchy, but through earned respect and demonstrated competence. Captain David Williams, who commanded Company A, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his men than any other company commander in the battalion. Most were downgraded or ignored due to racial prejudice, only being properly recognized decades later. The 761st's success came partly from their exceptional cooperation with infantry units. Despite initial prejudice from white infantry units, the tankers' combat performance quickly earned respect. During the assault on Klimbach, France, white infantrymen specifically requested the 761st's support, having seen their effectiveness in previous engagements. The battalion's consistent willingness to provide close support, often at great risk, saved countless infantry lives. One infantry sergeant wrote home, "The coloured tank boys saved our bacon more times than I can count. They'd drive right into German fire to give us cover. I don't care what anyone says back home. These men are heroes." The 761st's aggressive combat style was reflected in their ammunition consumption. They fired over 300 tons of ammunition during their deployment, an extraordinary amount for a single battalion. This wasn't wasteful shooting, but sustained, accurate fire that reflected their extensive training. German after-action reports frequently noted the accuracy of American tank fire in sectors where the 761 Saint operated. As casualties mounted, the 761st faced a unique problem. The segregated army had limited numbers of trained black tank crew replacements. Many of the new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were raw and untrained or, being rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. This meant that experienced crew members couldn't be rotated out for rest. Exhausted men continued fighting because there was no one to replace them. This contributed to both the extraordinary heroism and the high casualty rate. The presence of the 761st created problems for German propaganda. Soldiers who had faced them couldn't reconcile their experience with official Nazi racial theory. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 note increasing skepticism about racial propaganda among troops who had faced black American units. Soldiers were asking, "If the racial theory is true, why are we losing to inferior races?" This cognitive dissonance contributed to the collapse of fighting spirit in many German units during the war's final months. Before deployment, the 761st had trained in the American South under Jim Crow conditions. Most of the black tankers had to train in installations located in southern states such as Kentucky, Louisiana, and Texas. In the days before the civil rights advances made in the 1960s, black people were still treated harshly in the South and often considered inferior by white residents. At Camp Hood, Texas, they faced constant racial harassment. Local businesses refused to serve them. Military buses were segregated. The battalion was housed in the worst part of the base, near the sewage treatment plant. Yet this adversity forged extraordinary unity. The men of the 761 Saint knew they were fighting two wars, one against the Germans, another against racism. This dual purpose gave them a determination that German forces couldn't understand or overcome. The most famous member of the 761st was First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt, Jackie Robinson. During the 761st's training, a white bus driver told Robinson to move to the back of the bus. Robinson refused and was arrested. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates refused to consider the court-martial charges put forward by the arresting military policeman. The post commander transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign the insubordination court-martial order. Robinson was court-martialed but acquitted on all charges. However, the legal proceedings meant he missed the 761st's deployment to Europe. He received an honourable discharge in November 1944 and would go on to break baseball's colour barrier in 1947. On November 10, 2005, a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, Texas. The monument features 4 black granite tablets surrounding a life-size marble sculpture of a 761st Tank Battalion fighter kneeling atop a black granite pedestal engraved with a tank on the front and a panther on the back. The dedication was attended by surviving veterans, their families, and military officials. The keynote speaker noted that the 761st had fought not just for victory over Nazi Germany, but for the principle that all Americans, regardless of race, could serve their country with distinction. Perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. In the 1990s, American military historians interviewing former Wehrmacht veterans about tank warfare encountered consistent mentions of exceptional American tank units. When asked to identify these units, German veterans frequently described the black tankers, who had fought with particular ferocity and skill. These were men who had no reason to praise their former enemies, yet they consistently identified the 761st as among the best tank units they had faced. One former German tank commander stated simply, "They fought like devils." We couldn't understand why men their own country treated as inferior fought so hard for it. Now I think perhaps that was why. They had something to prove, and they proved it. The human cost of the 761st Service was severe. With nearly 50% casualties, the battalion paid a heavy price for their achievements. Families received telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands and fathers had died fighting for a country that didn't grant them full citizenship rights. Yet the survivors rarely expressed bitterness about this contradiction. Leonard Smith, who became a New York City transit officer after the war, said in a 1995 interview, "We knew what we were fighting for was bigger than the prejudice we faced. We were fighting for what America could be, not what it was." For decades, the 761st story was largely unknown outside the black community. History books, when they mentioned black soldiers at all, typically focused on support units. The combat achievements of units like the 761st were minimized or ignored. This began to change in the 1970s with the civil rights movement's emphasis on recovering black history. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought national attention. The 1997 Medal of Honor ceremony brought even more. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is recognized as one of the most effective armored units in the European theater. Their story is taught at the U.S. Army Armor School, studied at military academies, and honored in museums. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion remains relevant today. It demonstrates that prejudice and discrimination waste human potential. The Army's initial reluctance to use black soldiers in combat roles nearly deprived it of one of its best tank battalions. It also shows that excellence cannot be suppressed by prejudice. Despite facing discrimination from their own country and deadly hatred from their enemies, the men of the 761 achieved extraordinary things through skill, courage, and determination. Their story challenges us to examine our own prejudices and preconceptions. If Nazi Germany, one of history's most militarily proficient nations, could be so catastrophically wrong about racial capabilities, what assumptions do we make today that might be equally false? The 761st's combat record became a powerful argument for military integration. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, the combat achievements of units like the 761 Saint were specifically cited as evidence that segregation weakened military effectiveness. During the Korean War, integrated units performed exceptionally well, validating what the 761 had proven, that competence and courage know no racial boundaries. Many veterans of the 761 served as advisors during this integration process, sharing lessons learned from their unique experience. Individual veterans of the 761st faced varied post-war experiences. Some, like E.G. McConnell, used the GI Bill to get college educations that would have been impossible before the war. Others faced continued discrimination in employment and housing despite their service. Warren Cressy struggled with PTSD, then called combat fatigue, for years after the war. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke about his experiences. It wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that many families learned the full extent of their relatives' heroism. The full story of the 761st has been pieced together from various sources: official army records, German military archives, personal letters and diaries, and oral histories collected decades later. Each source adds details to the picture of extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. The U.S. Army's official history, published in the 1950s, barely mentioned the 761st. It took independent historians and the veterans themselves to ensure their story was preserved. Today, the National Archives holds extensive records of the battalion's service, available to researchers and the public. The 761st's liberation of Gunskirchen concentration camp is commemorated at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Survivors and their descendants have maintained connections with battalion veterans and their families. In 2015, the Austrian government invited surviving members of the 761st to ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. They were honoured not just as liberators, but as men who had shown humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances. The German Tigers and Panthers never expected the 761st Black Panthers to fight at all, much less to fight for 183 consecutive days without relief. Nazi racial ideology had assured them that black soldiers were incapable of operating tanks, lacking in courage, and would flee at first contact. Instead, they encountered men who had trained longer, fought harder, and endured more than almost any other American unit. The 761st didn't just help defeat Nazi Germany, they demolished its racial ideology through undeniable combat excellence. From the time they entered combat until the end of the war in Europe, the men of the 761 received 7 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor. These decorations, many awarded decades late due to racial prejudice, only hint at the full extent of their heroism. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 days without relief, not because they weren't exhausted. They were. Not because they didn't suffer casualties. They lost nearly half their men. They fought because they carried the hopes and dignity of millions of black Americans who were told they weren't good enough to serve their country in combat. Every Sherman tank they drove into battle carried more than ammunition. It carried the weight of representation, the burden of proof, and the determination to demonstrate that courage and competence know no colour. Every German position they destroyed struck a blow not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the racial prejudices of 2 nations, their enemies and their own. The German forces that faced them learned a lesson that challenged everything they had been taught. The black soldiers they had been told were subhuman proved to be extraordinary humans. The inferior troops demonstrated superior courage. The men who shouldn't have been able to operate complex machinery mastered tank warfare at the highest level. In the end, the 761st Tank Battalion's greatest victory wasn't capturing towns or destroying enemy tanks. It was proving, beyond any doubt, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, that excellence is not determined by race, but by training, determination, and character. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting. And for 183 days without relief, against enemies who never expected them to fight at all, they never stopped. Their legacy lives on, not just in military history, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and recognition that their sacrifice helped advance. The German Tigers expected easy prey. They found instead the Black Panthers, and learned that everything they believed about race and war was wrong.